Hello, this is the game Philosopher. I'm your host, Dale. And today, let's talk about one of the most controversial philosophers. In fact, in philosophy, there has been a lot of controversy from uh, Martin Heidegger being a Nazi who was still somehow very pro Jewish to Michel Foucault and some of the things he did in his life, as well as his philosophy of postmodernism, which a lot of people do not understand. But when it comes to controversy, there has been no greater name to mention than Aristotle. He's controversial, but not for those really messed up reasons. He didn't do much that was messed up. In fact, the only thing that we would say causes a lot of controversy in this day and age is because he was pro-slavery in his day and age, uh, which he does give some ideas for the ethical treatment of slaves and all. As you see, that's very common back in his time period. In fact, Seneca does the same. Uh, St. Paul does the same. It's very common during that time period that the philosophers actually advocated for an ethical treatment of slavery. Not to say that slavery is right, because it's actually wrong. I would agree with a lot of modern people that it is very much wrong. But that's not where I want to focus on his controversy. In fact, um, people have called him the philosopher par excellence. People have called him a villain for the reason I mentioned. People have pretty much made fun of him because he got the amount of teeth in a woman wrong. He was a geocentrist who believed in circular or around Earth, and this actually has made him held by some scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson, famously. Of course, as people laud his name and other people condemn it. Who is Aristotle? I would have to say that the philosopher par excellence is the most important title for him, and he gives us an example of what is, in my opinion, a true philosopher in the most systemic sense or systematic sense. So, if you're going to read Aristotle, there's one thing you need to know, and that is throughout his works, whether it's from the rhetoric, the poetics, the politics, Nicomachean ethics, uh, even De Anima. He tends to cite other works he's made. He also deals with several ideas from the pre-Socratics and the Socratics, as he seeks to give us a comprehensive system of philosophy. And in doing this, he actually goes through several fields of thinking within his different like his different philosophical treatises. In fact, in the metaphysics, there's actually a pretty good section on epistemology, which I believe is in the Gamma section, and so on and so on and so on. I would have to say it's also very impressive that he also looks at the sciences. In fact, a lot of scientists laud Aristotle more than anyone else, even though they don't really quite use his methods so much. In fact, the scientists of today would rather use something later that was developed by Sir Francis Bacon and others called the scientific method, which I will not criticize in this video because I think that would be irrelevant. And I would have to say that, and you look at Aristotle, you see a man who was so famous and so wise that he was hired by a king to educate his son. His son was Alexander the Great. And what does Alexander the Great do? He goes on to conquer the world with arguably some of the skills that Aristotle gives him. In fact, he made a speech to men who were deserting, and he pretty much shamed those men, and had them uh, reconsider the things with their conscience because of some of the skills which Aristotle taught him in the rhetoric. And you could read about that in some of the ancient historians. Of course, to whether or not he actually said the speeches in the way which he said them, that's actually uh, debatable. But regardless, he most likely used Aristotle's thinking. There are some comical stories about him indirectly, such as when Diogenes was trolling Alexander. Aristotle saved his life because Aristotle taught Alexander the Great that the love of philosophy is important and to respect philosophers. And so when Diogenes was like, "Get out of my light," Aristotle showed a lot of respect towards him, respect that was probably not due. But regardless, it stopped Aristotle. Aristotle stopped Alexander from being a tyrant and cutting off Diogenes' head. So, what sorts of things can we learn from Aristotle? Well, for one, the use of categories is so important. You don't have to use the categories of being necessarily unless you're talking about ontology. Uh, but you can actually, well, like even so, you could actually widely use the categories of being, such as the genus and the uh, different ways in which Aristotle has categorized things to actually observe things quite well. In fact, genus, species, etc., we see scientists still using that type of terminology today, although they don't really have a clear grasp on it. And uh, when you have Aristotle, not only do you categorize things, but you're going to look at things in great detail. You're going to look at the metaphysics, the physics, the rhetoric, logic, politics, ethics, and what you see within Aristotle, like the thought of Aristotle in particular, and it's kind of followed to a certain degree by different people, the Parapathetic traditions that we're aware of, is they will take everything. They'll take every science or art they can find, and they connect the dots, trying to find the first principle of things. And the reason why is because Aristotle says that wisdom is the science of finding the first principles of things. And so the love of wisdom is the love of finding these first principles. And so Aristotle, he does not just find these first principles or attempt to find these first principles. He's teaching us how to find these first principles. You're going to look at epistemology, ethics, uh, um, phenomenology, politics, science, and all sorts of things, literature, and you're going to observe them all and connect these dots, you connect these webs of thinking, and you're going to condense different arts down into their primary principles. Then you expand on, expand on, expand on, and that is pretty much how a very big simplification of how Aristotle did things. But what I find is most interesting is when you read Aristotle and you read him properly, that is, you read multiple books of his at once. That actually is a really good way to study a philosophical tradition because you can look at what Aristotle thought here and there, and so on and so on and so on. In fact, I would say it might even be a good idea to look at the ones who criticize the philosophy you're looking at. And I have found that in doing these things, you could actually understand someone's thinking very well. I've actually done the similar thing to Hegel. People say his phenomenology of spirit is some of the most difficult things to understand. I still agree with this, even with the methodology which I just explained. But it was sure helpful to look at it with the science of logic and the philosophy of right having been read under my belt, and even at the same time as I'm trying to tackle the phenomenology of spirit. Obviously, he's still hard to uh, tackle, but anyway, back on Aristotle. Largely speaking, we see that the philosopher looks at every single science and every single art he can. And this is how you do philosophy, is you kind of become a more well-rounded thinker, not in the sense of liberal arts. You're not just doing it just to expand the mind. You're doing it to have tools to understand reality and looking at the soul of things, the first principle of things. And in this, there's not much failure. In fact, you'll see that a lot of times, even contemporary philosophers will take from several sources. Some of them will use a different method, which is making monographs. Monographs, they can be tricky at times. I would say that they are almost useless because while they are focused, they don't cover as many sciences and arts to reduce to a first principle. In fact, they expand everything, put all as much knowledge as they can about a particular art or science. With this method of taking as much knowledge as you can on a broad sense and deducing it down into first principles, that seems to help not only come up with an ability to draw from several sources to understand something, but it also helps to actually be able to find the first principles of things. And as you do it and do it and do it, you actually will find that you will be a better philosopher for it. So that's enough for this video. Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you for watching. Tell me, would you rather study something, just one thing, and do it in a very, very narrow manner as a monograph? Or would you rather draw from several sources that you can find and condense things down to the first principle? Tell me, is there advantage you see there? Is there disadvantage? Just tell me everything. But one thing's for sure is if you hit the bell button and subscribe and like this video, you'll be doing me a favor and you'll be able to hear more videos on philosophy.